It appears on flags, in news photographs, in films, and in conflicts far removed from the country that first adopted it. The AK-47 may be one of the most recognizable industrial objects of the 20th century. Yet it is also routinely described as old, crude, or obsolete. That contradiction is the story. This is not a story about a flawless machine. It is a story about what happens when a design meets a state recovering from war, a manufacturing system working under pressure, institutions able to distribute a standard widely, and a culture that keeps repeating the image long after the original context has changed. To understand why the AK became a global symbol, start not with a legend of one inventor or with a shortcut comparison to a German predecessor, but with the Soviet problem after the Second World War. The Red Army had learned that infantry combat, industrial capacity, and standardization had to be considered together. The question was larger than a single object: what could be adopted, produced at scale, supplied through a vast state system, and remembered as part of a new post-war identity? By 1945, the Soviet Union had an enormous army, devastated cities and factories, and an urgent question about the future of its infantry. During the war, Soviet troops had relied on bolt-action rifles designed in the late 19th century, alongside vast numbers of submachine guns. One offered range and simplicity, but had to be cycled by hand after every shot. The other delivered a high volume of fire at close range. Between them was a gap. That gap leads to the central paradox of this story. The rifle popularly known as the AK-47 did not remain visible because time somehow stopped in 1947. It endured because it survived a selection process, entered mass production, crossed borders, and was repeated by popular culture until it came to represent far more than a single model. The Germans had demonstrated one possible answer with the STD-44, a weapon built around an intermediate cartridge and a new idea of infantry combat. The Soviets did not need to copy a German mechanism to understand the importance of the category. They needed their own answer, one that could satisfy Soviet requirements, survive military testing and, above all, be manufactured by a country still rebuilding its industrial capacity. The road to the AK did not begin with one moment of inspiration, and it did not end with a single rival. Carbines, automatic weapons, and experienced designers were all competing for the same decision. What was at stake was not merely the shape of a rifle, but the combination of doctrine, manufacturing, and engineering that the Soviet state would carry into the post-war world. A prototype can impress on a workbench. A service weapon has to defeat its competitors, pass official trials, enter production, reach the troops, become part of their training, and remain supported for years. The design matters, but the design alone cannot explain who made those decisions or who kept the production line running afterwards. Mikhail Timofeyevich Kalashnikov was born in 1919, into a rural family in the Altai region. Long before his name became inseparable from the rifle, he worked with machinery and served in Soviet tank forces. In 1941, he was badly wounded in fighting near Bryansk. While recovering, he began thinking about small arms for the soldiers who would return to the front. The popular version turns this into a perfect scene: a wounded sergeant sketches a weapon in hospital, and the AK-47 appears. The real process took far longer. Kalashnikov did not leave hospital carrying the finished design. He developed ideas, entered competitions, worked in military workshops, and received help from technicians, engineers, and collaborators. He was competing with experienced designers inside a system backed by state institutions. His name remained attached to the rifle. The process itself never belonged to one man. His earlier designs were not adopted, but every attempt brought him closer to the institutions that control testing, materials, and access to workshops. That persistence explains his importance without turning him into a myth. Kalashnikov did not succeed because he stood outside the system. He succeeded after learning to work within it, surrounded by people who could turn a mechanical idea into a serious military candidate. If you enjoy stories about the people and systems behind famous weapons, subscribe to Arsenal Context. We still have to reach the moment when the first Kalashnikov was rejected, then returned almost unrecognizable. First, though, there is a controversy that has followed the AK for decades. Place the STG-44 beside a Kalashnikov and the visual resemblance is obvious. Both emerged from the same revolution in infantry weapons. Both have the silhouette the 20th century made familiar, and both answered pressures revealed by the Second World War. But that does not make one a mechanical copy of the other. The small arms survey acknowledges German and American influences, while also pointing to fundamental differences in the Soviet design. The STG-44 helped make the importance of this new category impossible to dismiss. Kalashnikov and his team still had to create a different architecture, shaped by Soviet requirements and by the Soviet selection process. Influence explains part of the origin. A direct copy is a much larger claim than the evidence supports. Before this video, did you think the AK was simply a copy of the STG-44? Answer yes or no in the comments, then keep that answer in mind as we follow what the Soviet trials actually changed. In 1946, the Soviet government opened a competition for the new weapon. The early rifles, now known as the AK-47, reached the evaluation stage, but they did not settle the contest. Kalashnikov's first proposal had problems and underwent a major redesign. That detail matters because it destroys the idea of an inevitable design that succeeded at its first attempt. The weapon that returned to trials the following year had changed considerably. It was not merely an AK-47 with a few corrections. The team reorganized the design, responded to the evaluations and produced a more convincing candidate. In 1947, the Kalashnikov design was selected to advance to troop trials. Then, in June 1949, the Soviet Union formally adopted the weapon as the AK, a Russian abbreviation for Kalashnikov automatic rifle. The term AK-47 was also associated with prototypes and trials from that period. Later, it became a popular label for very different rifles within the wider family. Between selection and adoption came initial production and troop evaluation. That 2-year gap explains why individual dates can be misleading. 1947 identifies the design that became famous. 1949 marks the formal decision to put it into service. The history cannot be reduced to one anniversary, because an institution does not turn a drawing into a standard weapon all at once. Winning a competition did not mean the rifle was perfect. It meant that, at that moment, the Soviet state judged it capable of meeting a military requirement and moving into production. The best rifle in the world is a slogan. The candidate an institution chose to manufacture, distribute, and support is a historical decision we can actually examine. That decision also helped create the reputation that followed. The AK became known for its ability to keep working in difficult conditions. But the word reliable is often treated as though it describes some magical property, independent of materials, manufacturing, quality control, or context. It does not. The design involved compromises. Its reputation grew from a combination of engineering choices, military expectations, and experiences repeated by different users and institutions. Concrete decisions carried that reputation further. Governments looked to earlier adopters. A factory received tooling and technical documents. An army inherited training methods and stockpiles. With every new adoption, choosing something different could mean new contracts, new parts, new production lines, and new habits. Reliability helped the system grow. The size of the system helped the reputation travel. Yet early production was anything but simple. The Soviet plan relied on stamped sheet metal to manufacture rifles in huge numbers, but the first production line struggled to achieve consistent results. Factories still had to master stamping, welding, heat treatment, and quality control on a post-war scale. Rather than abandon the weapon, the Soviets spent years using a solution that was heavier and slower to produce. This period almost disappears from the popular story because it does not fit the legend of instant simplicity. The rifle had been selected, but the factory still had to learn how to deliver it. The turning point came in 1959, with the adoption of the modernized AKM. Lighter and designed around a stamping process that industry had finally mastered, it became the form many countries would copy or manufacture under license. The AKM was not simply a newer rifle placed beside the old one. It closed the gap between the original ambition for mass production and what factories could repeat consistently. Once stamping became routine, large-scale manufacture no longer depended on the heavier interim solution. Its reputation for simplicity appeared only after factories and engineers had solved a difficulty the eventual user would never see. In other words, much of what the public calls an AK-47 is actually an AKM or some other derivative. The original AK opened the road. The AKM made that road easier for industry to follow, turning one model into a reproducible pattern. If you arrived for the reputation of the AK but stayed for the factory and the adoption process, subscribe. Next, that production system leaves the factory and enters the world's news footage. Vietnam turned that industrial pattern into a global image. Photographs and television reports placed Kalashnikov family rifles before audiences who may never have heard of the 1946 trials or the problems of early production. The war created a powerful visual story: American military technology on one side, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces associated with a simple and rugged Soviet weapon on the other. But even that image needs correcting. A publication by the United States Army Center of Military History notes that many communist fighters used the Chinese Type 56, itself based on the Soviet design. To soldiers, journalists, and later to filmmakers, the distinctions could disappear beneath the name AK-47. It was a convenient label. Historically, it merged different variants and different countries of origin. Vietnam matters precisely because it shows how a pattern becomes a symbol. The news image did not need to identify the correct factory or model in order to work. The silhouette was enough. Through that visual archive, the Kalashnikov came to represent irregular war, revolution, Soviet alliance, resistance, threat, or liberation, depending entirely on who was looking. Share this video with someone who calls every Kalashnikov rifle an AK-47. The difference between an AK, an AKM, and a Type 56 seems small until you realize that it tells the story of how the pattern crossed borders. After the AKM, the family continued to change. In 1974, the Soviet Union adopted the AK-74, built around a different cartridge and a new set of military priorities. Later decades brought other series, modernizations, and national versions. The family survived precisely because it did not remain still. The family moved through military alliances, industrial agreements, and very different national decisions. China, Romania, Bulgaria, Egypt, Yugoslavia, Finland, and other countries developed their own relationships with the pattern. Some production was licensed. Other production followed paths that are harder to trace. One small arms survey study identified copies or production of the family in at least 19 countries and more than 100 derivatives over time. Every new factory changed the meaning of the name. In Soviet service, AK was a specific designation. A fighter might instead be carrying a Chinese-produced Type 56. In an Eastern European country, the pattern might arrive through a license, industrial tooling, and a separate political decision. For a distant audience, all those histories were compressed into 4 characters, AK-47. That is why the figure of 100 million should be treated as an estimate, not a scoreboard. Published research has offered a very wide range, from tens of millions to 100 million. Counting is difficult because Soviet records were incomplete, many countries produced their own versions, and the name AK-47 came to absorb rifles that never carried that designation. The uncertainty is part of the story. The family spread faster than anyone could document it. That industrial inheritance also explains how a weapon can appear obsolete and still remain in service. An army does not replace one object. It has to replace stockpiles, training, spare parts, contracts, established habits and, in some cases, production capacity. In some places, a newer model justifies that disruption. In others, maintaining or modernizing the existing pattern is the cheaper and more predictable decision. Technical age and institutional survival do not run on the same clock. Then came a second network, one without ministries or assembly lines: popular culture. The Kalashnikov silhouette already carried decades of history when film and television began using it as visual shorthand. Before a character said a word, the object could suggest a foreign army, an insurgent group, a villain, a revolution, or simply danger. Video games expanded that language. GoldenEye introduced a stylized version to one generation. Call of Duty turned entire families of weapons into a global vocabulary. Counter-Strike taught millions of players to recognize the shape, the sound, and the name before they knew anything about Mikhail Kalashnikov, the AK-47 or the AKM. Popular culture did not teach the history. It taught recognition. That recognition then shaped the way people saw the real world. When a photograph showed a curved magazine and a familiar stock, the audience already had a label ready, AK-47. The name still worked when the weapon was an AKM, a Type 56 or another variant. Film, television, games, and news reporting had created a kind of standardization of their own, a standardization of memory. Where did you first recognize this silhouette? In the news, in a film, or in a game? Choose one of those three. If you remember, tell us the title or the news story as well. Mikhail Kalashnikov lived until 2013 and saw his surname travel far beyond any individual's control. The design associated with him became a state product, an industrial family, an instrument of foreign policy, and a cultural symbol. None of those chapters erases the designer. They explain why his contribution traveled so far beyond the workshop where it began. So why did the Kalashnikov refuse to disappear? Not because the first model was perfect. It survived because the first proposal could be rejected and redesigned, because industry corrected its own limitations, because the AKM turned the design into a reproducible pattern, because states and allies carried it across the world, and because wars, the flag of Mozambique, films, and games transformed its shape into a language. The AK-47 recognized around the world today is less a single rifle than a compressed history. Inside that name are the original AK, the AKM, the Type 56, the AK-74, and many other versions the public learned to place within the same family. The obsolescence of one model cannot dismantle an industrial, political, and cultural network built over decades. The final answer does not lie in one isolated quality. Design got the rifle selected, factory supplied the scale, and geopolitics carried the family across borders. Popular culture did something else. It kept the silhouette alive after the history behind it had faded. Which part most changed the way you see the Kalashnikov, the redesign after rejection, the factory, or the way popular culture erased the differences between models? Leave your answer in the comments and subscribe to Arsenal Context. Here, the famous silhouette is where we begin. The real story is how a rejected prototype became a name the world uses for an entire family.